Hello YouTube and welcome back. Today we're going to be forging a fibula or Roman toga pin. This is based on a couple of iron examples I came across on the internet, and here is my interpretation of it. So this is basically like a spring-loaded safety pin. The materials we're going to be using for this are a length of 10mm round bar and a 4mm welding rod. We only need a small fire for this, so I've made this quite compact, and we're going to be starting with the bow of the fibula itself. First off, we're going to flatten the end of the round bar. In order to flatten this, you can see I am forging two bevels and then flattening out the centre. This gives me maximum spread, and I'm forging this down to a thickness of about 3mm, and I'm taking care to keep this nice and rectangular. The dimension here is roughly 15mm wide by 3mm thick by 50mm long. At this stage I am going to mark in 15mm from the outside. And I'm going to carefully centre dot that point. I will then come up to that centre dot and I will carefully set down the material. I want to keep a 15mm square section on the end. The rest of the bar will be forged down to 8 by 3mm. Again, I am being very careful to be accurate with my forge work. I want this project to be quite dimensionally accurate. Dressing in those lines. And I like to come in into the colder temperatures in order to planish the material. Until I end up with something like this. So we will now do further markings, and I will mark in 10mm from the end. Now I'm being careful not to centre dot too heavily because we don't want that centre dot to show up. I'm now going to go to a nice sharp shoulder on the anvil, give the material a good clean, and do a second set down. Once the set down's done, we are going to draw that end bit down to a taper, and this will be that scroll that you saw at the front. Again, I'm coming into the colder temperatures in order to planish, smooth and clean up the material. And I'm also making sure to keep everything nice and straight. Eyeballing it. And you can come in and you can dress that set down, give it a nice regular shape. If your hammer accuracy is good enough, you could equally hit the other side with the hammer. Till you end up with something like this. So you can see there's a slight taper to that point on the end. That tapers down to roughly 5mm. Now this will be the pin catch. Before drawing out the pin catch, I'm going to form the scroll itself. Mainly because the pin catch will be quite thin and I don't want to risk damaging it by scrolling. So we're going to scroll most of the way, but not all of the way, because the scroll itself will be in the way of drawing out the pin catch. This is quite a delicate little scroll, so I'm able to carry on forming it again at lower temperatures. Working your iron or steel at lower temperatures does also help reduce the amount of scale produced and the volume of material you lose through oxidization. Keep dressing it flat. And this is a nice, tight, compact scroll. That's probably as far as I'm going to go with this because I don't want to get into the way of peening out the pin catch. Again, keep cleaning it. Always work with clean material. And here we have the scroll quite nicely started. So at this stage we are going to draw out this pin catch. So in order to do that I'm going to cross peen it, and we need to be quite careful which side it goes on. It's going to be going on the underside, so we're going to cross peen it out from the... We're going to peen it down on the side where the scroll is upright, which means that we can then fold it out underneath. Now again, this is such a small object, your hammer accuracy needs to be quite good. And we're cross-peening it in order to draw it out lengthways rather than mushing it out through 360 degrees. And we will get quite a nice long piece. I'm going to dress this in as I go along in order to keep a nice straight aspect. And then once I've drawn it out as far as I can, I'll just quickly come over to the vise and I will just give those sides a little bit of a square off and dress that top section to be a little bit more rounded and aesthetically pleasing. The material is quite thin, so it doesn't take much filing. You can see this in real time. Like so. So at this stage we're ready to cut off the body of the bow itself. So I will mark that up. And very carefully I will give it a light tap. Ideally without hitting the face of the anvil with the hot set. With that removed, I will give that cut edge a little bit of a file to take off the sharp corner. Until we have a piece like so. This tab, the pin holder, is going to be folding over here and the pin is going to be coming from this direction. So the pin itself needs to be slightly offset in order to meet the pin holder in the right place. As such, I'm going to forge in the tail of this piece in order to offset the pin. So I'm going to mark it. Now I'm not going to centre dot it because I don't want to leave a centre dot mark on the bow itself. So I'm going to mark up the anvil and use that as a reference point. And I'll come in with my ball peen and I'll just create a rounded set down and draw out that end. Now if you notice the tab sticking upwards, that is actually a mistake. That set down should be the other side. And I didn't actually realise until I'd made the pin itself. So if you are going to have a go at making this yourself, or you are considering buying the drawings are accurate. So as I'm setting down, I will make sure that it stays at 3mm thickness. I will forge that out to a taper, which can then be scrolled over to hold the pin spring. Check for straightness. And we're forging this down to about 6mm. Like so. Now remember, this set down is the wrong side currently. Now at this stage I'm going to put an almost right angle just behind the pin catch. Now it's a right angle up until the scroll. This is what you see on the originals. And then we are going to scroll downwards in order to create that little loop which will hold the pin spring. Now this obviously needs to remain open, so I'm taking quite a lot of care to not close this up completely. Again, keep dressing it square so that it is perpendicular to the body of the brooch. And I will keep forming it with a piece of 4mm welding rod, just to make sure that the spring itself is going to fit through there. And this is the end result. Again, I've been continuously keeping this clean because it's such a small scale object. it will very quickly accumulate scale marks. So now we'll come over to the bick, and we will first form one end as a bow, and then we'll turn it round and actually form out the other end to a bow. We'll make sure that we don't get any distortion or any twisting, and I will at this stage knock the tab over. Now, a slightly better method of doing this, which minimises distortion, would be to actually hold with a pair of flat tongs just behind the scroll and actually knock it over at that point. So then get the whole thing warm, take out any distortion which may have occurred. With my comedically small hammer. And then I kind of decided to go over to my bickern and mark out an accurate point, which is 34mm diameter, and I'll just form that to a final round shape. Now this occurred later in the process. You can see I've actually opened up that loop ready for the spring. And then at this stage, with the shape of the bow complete, I'm going to take that scroll the rest of the way to a point just above the catch. And you end up with something like this. So with the bow made, we're going to move on to making the spring pin itself. Now this is a 4mm welding rod. Just knock off the flux. Wear a mask as you're doing this. And on a low fire, I'm going to warm up the end, and I'm going to draw that out, forge it down to about 3mm. Best way to draw out any stock, but small stock in particular, is as a series of set downs. It just chomps through the metal beautifully. So with it being round bar, I first forged it down to square, and then knocked in the corners and forged it back round again. If you try and draw out round bar as round, it will take you quite a long time. It's much quicker to forge it to square and then round it off. And then I spent a little bit of time just cold hammering it, not particularly heavily, but just to give it some dimensional accuracy and smooth out the bar. So here we have a two-sided set down on the 4mm round drawn out to 3mm. It might not sound like it makes a lot of difference, but it will affect how your pin rotates and functions. So at this stage we are going to fold the 3mm section on the set down back over onto the 4mm round section. Like so. Now the next steps have to be fairly accurate. With the 3mm section facing you, you will twist it off to the left. and then we will square that off and make sure everything is straight and true. And that is the pin / spring being separated from the actual pintle. Now this technique was suggested by one of my students, Andrew Warman, after I showed him some of the archaeological objects. So thank you, Andrew. Now at this stage we are going to wrap the 3mm section clockwise as it's facing you to create a bit of a loop. We want to go about 3/4 of the way around. We will dress that. Again, keeping everything tight and square. So that it appears thus. So now we're going to form the loop of the spring, and we will bend that over. Now the best way to bend these is to completely overbend them and then straighten them out again. That way you end up with a nice tight radius around your scroll pliers, which are the pointy tongs. And then bend again. So the loop you've created wants to have an internal measurement of roughly 9mm square. Again, overbend and straighten out, and that will give you a nice tight radius. And the excess material, after you created the bend, wants to pass under the 4mm on the opposite side from where it's going over. This is important for later. And at this stage we are going to wrap 2 loops of the remaining 3mm round around the 4mm. Say 2 loops, we're not going to do the full 2 loops at this stage, we're going to keep it a little bit open, which will make sense in a minute. Loop and dress. At this stage we are going to flatten out the rest of the 3mm section a little bit. This is accurate to one of the archaeological objects I've been looking at. And I believe it's to give the pin a little bit more tension, to save it bending out of through use. And at this point we will cut off the excess of 4mm material and I will just quickly give that cut edge a little bit of a file to clean it up without removing too much material at this stage. So now's the complicated bit. We are actually going to open up that loop and remove the 4mm pin and remove the 4mm pintle, like so. This is because the pin loop wants to be on the inside of the spring loop. So we're going to hold this quite low down and we're going to twist that bit of round mill, 3mm round, where it comes off from the first loop we did, and we're going to feed it back into the pin loop. Which means at this stage the pin is on the inside. like so. And at this stage, holding both the pintle and the spring loop, I am going to take the pin and finish that loop, and it's almost going to be folded in half. Though I'm not going to take it all of the way at this point. So now we're going to draw out the point on the pin itself. Ideally, I would have given myself maybe an extra 5 or 6 millimeters more material. But we're going to draw that out. So because it's a round aspect, we're going to draw it square. Now remember, we have a flattened area at the back that we're going to preserve. So we're just going to draw it out to a rounded point below that. And I'm forging it cold because I want to work harden it and give it some rigidity. Don't overdo that because you may end up splitting that material. Cold working helps planish it as well, gives us a nice smooth finish. Now, if I'd given myself more material, such as this demonstration example here, I would actually cut it just behind the pin catch and draw it out to the correct length. The pin itself doesn't want to come out beyond the pin catch, but the best way to cut it is just a cold set, a hot set, and weaken that material enough that you can snap it. Now, if we ignore that previous incarnation of a different version of the pin, the next stage, as you've made the pin, is to actually go back and open up that loop that you forged at the end of your bow. You can then take your pin, give it a test. You can see that it still opens a bit too much, so that will need to be closed up. However, I will sort this out first. So the spring itself needs to come down, and I also need to tighten up the distance between the two loops so that there's no rattle in this. We'll just squeeze that shut. So first off, we will close the loop using the scroll pliers, which again are the pointy tongs. And it's just a case of squeezing that loop shut, checking the movement of the hinge, checking the movement of the pin, and tightening as you go along. I will spend a little bit of time making sure this is accurate and testing the hinge itself. And then work towards squeezing the spring shut, making sure the loops are pretty well orientated in the same direction. And then once I'm quite happy with the fit, I'm going to work towards squeezing the pin down from the spring. So holding the spring and the bow, I'm just squeezing that pin down, and I want it to sit maybe 6 or 7 millimeters above the pin catch. And here we have it. Just checking that. Just checking that the pin will sit in the pin catch. And the last thing I'll do is just file down that pintle to just above the spring. And here we have the completed fibula. In order to fund these videos, we've decided to produce accurate step-by-step drawings of the objects being made. So if you'd like to make a fibula, have a look in the description and you will find a link to actually purchase those drawings. They're step-by-steps with accurate dimensions, etc. Tool list. So if you're interested, go and have a look at those. And the proof of the plum is in the pudding. So here is the fibula being fitted to a knitted fabric. Obviously if you try and wear this with silk, it's going to blow a hole the size of whales in it, so probably best keep it for knitwear. Thanks for watching.